Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about how to best use the reading week. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website, Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about how to best use the reading week, assuming you even have one this year, because it's 2020. So who knows?
Right. And I think a lot of schools are actually compressing their schedule and phasing these out. So, maybe this doesn't apply to you, but you can probably still extrapolate.
Yeah. So before we jump in, what is traditionally a reading week?
Well, the traditional reading week is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically a week that you get right before exams, probably not to read things particularly, not to read cases and that kind of thing. Please don't do that. But really, it is kind of a focused study time. So the idea is rather than just, your classes end and then 2 days later you start your exams, typically law schools have given you a week or so before that first exam starts. And that's really when you can do some concentrated studying.
Yeah. And I think that what might be interesting is to see how schools do this, because even when I was in law school, we didn't have a full reading week. We had reading days. I even think with these condensed schedules, the schools might get a little creative. It's just really time after classes are done that you're supposed to be studying for finals. It doesn't really matter if it's a week or a couple of days or a long weekend, or maybe it becomes Thanksgiving. Who knows this year? I mean, it's all going to be very different.
Right. I mean, some universities I know are trying to give exams or at least not be in person after Thanksgiving.
I have heard that as well.
Yeah. So basically find out what your school's doing. Assume probably you're going to have some type of time period before your exams start, after your classes end. It may be compressed. And we can talk later about what to do in that scenario where you don't have this traditional reading week. But, for now, let's assume that you're going to have at least some time that you can study for your exams.
Yep. Okay, so if you have some time, you might be wondering, what's the best use of my time? And I think that the hardest thing to remember is that you're supposed to really be practicing and not, let's say, making all your outlines during this time.
Right. I think that's probably the biggest misconception people have is they think, great, I have 4 days, 5 days before my first exam. I'll just do my outline then. That is generally not an advisable situation to put yourself in because at that point, and I'm not saying that maybe I didn't do this my first semester, but I would really recommend trying to get your study materials at least mostly completed earlier, because otherwise you don't have the time to do the practice that you need to be doing. And also if you have to do memorization, if you have closed book exams, or, you're going to effectively be memorizing things even with open book tests. We have some podcasts on this. But this is ideally the time where you are really focusing in and honing your exam taking skills, not focusing in on making sense of that material.
Exactly. And I think that given COVID, I think most people are going to have some sort of open note exam.
Right.
And I think it's very important for people to really think about how you're going to be judged in those exams, because, it used to be if it was a closed book exam, one of the things that you were being tested on is your ability to, retain lots of information and spit it back. But if you've kind of moved away from that a bit and you now have the comfort of your notes, or maybe you even have the comfort of a 12-hour take home. I mean, I think a lot of 1L profs are giving exams in formats that aren't typically 1L formats because of COVID. You got to think about how you're going to differentiate yourself from the person sitting next to you. And that means legal analysis and issue spotting and solid writing and communication skills, which means that those are the things you want to be focusing on during your reading week.
Yeah, absolutely. Although just to add a fun twist to it, I did speak with a student this week who said that her school has just announced that they're considering whether they're going to go kind of the online bar exam approach and give professors the option to use, something like ExamSoft with virtual proctoring to do closed book exams. So we can we can all think about whether that's a good idea. No, it's not. But if your professor is going to do that, then you need to be aware of that and kind of, plan to do a closed book type of exam. But generally speaking, I think most people are going to understand that, this is a strange situation and it's really obvious how you would cheat. So they may as well just let you use your notes because people would probably use them anyway.
Yeah. And we are talking to a lot of law students right now. Like it's just, it's that time of year. And over and over again, I'm hearing a lot of feedback from law students that especially during COVID, the piece that they're struggling with is this law to fact kind of analysis piece. And I think that for some students, maybe engaging with the material, especially if you're online in those lectures, can be tricky. When you're listening to your professors talk or give examples, or if there's dialogue with students that's helping you kind of practice, it can be hard to pick up that dialogue sometimes online. So, making sure that you're evaluating what you're struggling with going into this reading week is also key, because you need to be able to say, if I'm still working on, how to do the attack plan and the analysis for homicide, and I'm taking a crim exam, that's a huge problem. You're not going to be able to be successful in that. So that's just some other feedback I think I've been hearing too, is that students are finding that piece, which is always a bit of a challenge. I think in this virtual environment is even more of a challenge for some people.
No, that makes sense. I think the goal going into the reading week should be that you have a pretty clear understanding of where you personally are at and what you're going to need to do in this time period to get to where you want to be by the day that your exam starts. So, and this is not something that, say, you should wake up on Saturday morning when you have half of a week, right before the reading week and be like, all right, where am I? You need to have done this analysis beforehand and kind of really made a very, clear assessment, realistic assessment of where are you, and no judgment. You are where you are. Right. But I think,
what people, you do with that.
Right. And, I think definitely, I certainly had situations in law school where I was in like full on triage mode by the time the reading week rolled around. My second semester, I was basically clinically depressed. I hadn't been going to class. And I decided to take my exams. And so, that was not a great situation to be in, but I still did okay. I passed, But I think you have to be really realistic about where you are.
I think that's true. And don't get caught up in just making materials. I think one of the things you want to do during this reading week is finalize study materials, attack plans. We talk, I believe, in some of our other podcasts on open book tests about like the 2-page sheets, which you open like for a book for quick reference and things like that. But, the busy work is always a challenge. We find this in law school, and we've finding this a lot too with students studying for the bar. You become so compulsive about creating these study materials that you forget to use them and apply them.
Or you don't have time.
Or you don't have time because you've made the most beautiful looking outlines or flowcharts, but you've never practiced with them. So you've got to finalize those study materials, hopefully as early as possible, so you can use old exams, practice with them, and then be able to give yourself feedback, especially if those professors have released exam questions. And that's really a great thing to be doing during that reading week, testing the materials that you have, and then, giving yourself as much feedback as you can, whether it's from yourself, maybe professors will give you feedback, but probably not. Our tutors are going to be able to give people feedback in those final weeks. But you really want to be, evaluating how you're doing.
Right. And you mentioned old exams briefly. I think that's so critical. And if people haven't even, if you're listening to this and it's several weeks before this reading week or even a month or whatnot, if you haven't looked at any old exams that your professor has handed out, their actual test, I think that's really critical too, because that's going to really inform how you prepare. And I don't think you should read every single one of them and read the answers and that kind of thing. So you need to use the materials, but at least kind of look at them and say, okay, this is how they generally test, and make sure that you are preparing for that. If they're going to give multiple choice questions or something, you need to prepare for that. If they're giving you essays, like what type of essays, like what are they looking for? Are they short? Are they long? And obviously some of this may be different. But I think you can usually parse out, what their interests tend to be if you look at some of these. And then that can help inform what you need to be working on. Do they like to do policy discussions? Okay, you probably need some type of a study aid around that. The other thing I think sometimes people overlook is if your professor is holding any type of study sessions or that kind of thing, people sometimes think, oh, I don't have time for that. I think that's a mistake. I think generally you probably want to attend those.
Yeah. They're going to give some nuggets. And It's also possible that they're going to cover, or hint to what's actually, on those tests. And I think the thing about 1L exams specifically, for those of you who are getting ready for your first semester, is like they can only get so creative in some of these classes.
Right.
Civil procedure.
Like they're going to test personal jurisdiction.
Right.
Done.
Diversity is probably going to be on there. There's going to be there's just only so much that they can test. And so if you've reviewed their exams and you start to see some of those patterns, and then you go to their any study sessions that your professor might have, and they always talk about personal jurisdiction, then you want to make sure you always are ready for a personal jurisdiction question. And, I think a lot of times in law school, and I think I definitely would make this mistake sometimes, I wasn't thinking that strategically about it, about trying to suss out the game. And it will behoove you to think about it and look for those patterns and try and get more information.
Yeah, and I think too, look at the answers that they've handed out. Like often they'll be either they've drafted an answer, or even more beneficial typically is they've given you the best student answers. And it was sometimes surprising to find what people thought was good. It wasn't necessarily what you thought they would have thought was a good answer based on their performance in class. But suddenly you're like, oh, okay, so you're actually looking for a very straightforward IRAC when you're completely off in the clouds in this class. So I think figuring out what your professors are looking for and trying to give that is very beneficial. One thing on stuff that tends to be covered, I will just throw in as your nugget for listening. Anything they've covered in the last few classes has a disproportionate likelihood of showing up on that test. Why? Because they probably started writing it already and they know they need to cover this.
Yeah, that's true. And they also know that a lot of students kind of stop preparing for class and stop kind of investing in some of the new material at the end.
Right. And if you need to curve, that's a good way to do it.
Yes. It's, I always think about constitutional law, that typically when professors teach constitutional law, the last thing that they teach is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is always tested because it's very complicated and nuanced, and they sometimes have to rush through it because they're a little behind. And it's almost always shows up. Right.
Same thing in torts with product liability. If you cover product liability, it's probably at the very end, and it's very likely to show up on your exam.
Yeah. And and people are shocked by it. And it's like, this isn't shocking.
It's like we only spent one class on it. It's like, well, you spent a class on it.
Yeah.
If it was the last class, that's probably a pretty good sign you should have paid attention.
Yeah, exactly. So what about when you have, let's say most 1Ls are going to have 3 or 4 exams. How do you balance the time studying for all of them?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there are a couple of different ways to think about this. Some people say, okay, I'll just study for one exam and then that one's over and then I'll pick up the next one. That's typically not the best approach because you may have 4 or 5 days, including a weekend or something before your first test, but then maybe you only have a day or 2 for later ones. So I think you have to look at your own schedule and see, okay, how much time do I have between these, and then almost split the difference on the bigger amount of time you have in front so that you're covering each class right before that test. You also have to think about how you are doing in those classes. There may be one class you feel really strong in and then another class that you're definitely further behind. So, I think you have to consider that. Consider the type of exam. If it's a closed book test, maybe you have to study more for that intensely right before. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a number of different factors. One, you have to see the balance of the units for the class. I think that's always a nice place to start. If you have a 2-unit class and a 4-unit class, they probably don't get the same amount of time because they're not going to cover the same amount of material. I would always also encourage people to really force themselves to study the class they're worst at first, because one of the common things that happens is you have 5 days leading up to your first exam, and so you feel the best about contracts. So you're chugging through contracts, and you're like, I'll do 2 days on contracts. I'm doing great. And then, maybe your worst class is property. And then you do that, on the last day, but you're like, oh, I probably needed 3 days on property, but I hate it, so I'm going to save it till the end.
Right.
I just think like pushing early into your study plan, touching on the stuff that makes you the most uncomfortable is probably a good idea. I also think that, not getting too crazy about breaking up the days in multiple sections. I know that some people like to do that, especially if their exams are grouped very close together. They'll be like 2 hours here, 2 hours here, 2 hours here. I really think at the most you should do like 2 subjects a day, because you want to give yourself enough time to really get into it. And if you're doing this heavy lifting that we're talking about, which is writing a practice exam, reviewing it, making materials, reviewing those materials, doing more practice, that takes time. And in an hour or 2, you're not going to really be able to dive in, I think, to make much progress.
I think that's right. I agree with you. I think either 1 day per subject, or if you must split it up. And some people, think that they are better if they switch topics and they're fresher. So then maybe you do half a day on one, you take a test, you review it, you update your outlines accordingly. You go have lunch, you have some coffee, take a walk around the block, and then you switch to a different topic. I think that can work. But I agree with you. This sort of like, I'll do an hour here and an hour there is not like, you want to be doing that focused work, and switching between tasks is not typically helpful.
No, and there's all of this ramp up time,
Yeah.
I mean, I even find that, just getting ready to do this podcast, I get the alert on my computer. It's like, you have 10 minutes until this meeting.
Right.
And then I'm like, oh, I'll finish this one thing. And that took like 5 to 7 more minutes. And then you're scrambling because it still takes you time. It's
right.
Like, we just credit that there is time getting the right outlines open or gathering all your materials together. So I think you do want to be very, thoughtful about that. The other thing I would say is focusing on high impact study time. So, for all you guys who are studying right now, the election is super distracting. The world is super distracting. I think you really need to be thoughtful about how you're using your internet and social media, and making sure that the time you're putting in is actually real study time.
Right. I mean, if there's ever any time to do focused study, it is during the reading week. And you can frankly do a lot in the reading week time. I mean, I can definitely tell you that you can get a lot done if you really force yourself. I mean, you can't really do this now, but like what I would do is go literally like cloister myself in a library where I knew I wasn't going to find anybody else or anyone that I knew, and just be there for hours and hours and hours, and every hour I had my circle and I was like marking it off. And at the end of the day, I legitimately studied for say like 8 hours, and you can do a lot in that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you just stay, you just got to stay focused. It's really hard, guys. I mean, it's so hard. And I sympathize, because I think we're all struggling with this, and fatigue on top of that. But if you're going to put in the time and get work done. This isn't about number of hours necessarily. It's the impact of those hours.
Right. And I think you do want to be thinking about, how do you stay fresh? You can't just study 14 hours a day. Like, my example there is like, I did 8 solid hours. Someone's like, that doesn't sound like much at all, but that was 8 really focused brain hours.
Yeah.
And, to do that, you've really got to be thinking about like, okay, do I do 45 minutes and then I take a 15-minute break and I get outside and I walk around the block and maybe have a little bit of coffee and maybe have a little snack, and then I come back and I sit down. And then, at some point you probably take like an hour-long break and maybe you go to the gym or whatever it is. You've got to be thinking about how to physically and mentally balance this so that you can do that focused study. And there's really no point in just sitting there for 16 hours a day and like looking at your books and not getting anything done. Yeah. You're going to get tired. You're going to get frustrated. You've really got to be thinking about how do you stay fresh enough to really focus.
Yeah. So what about some of the mistakes about how people, are spending their time where they shouldn't be?
What not to do during the reading week?
What not to do?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is people who are reading cases at that point, maybe they fell behind and they think they'll catch up on their reading, or rereading cases because you think somehow that's going to help. It is way too late. Do not do that.
Yep. No, that's not going to help you get... Like, if you are in a reading cases point, you need to be like outlining and triaging, which we're going to talk about in just a second.
Yeah, and I mean, I know sometimes people try to catch up on the reading almost out of like a feeling of guilt that they didn't do it, but this is not really the time for that. Accept your guilt, like accept you didn't do it, give yourself a slap on the wrist, and then figure out what's actually going to help you.
Yeah, 100%. So, but if you're in a bad place, you don't just throw up your hands and just say, well, there goes the semester.
Right.
There's, like we've said, there's a lot of work and time to fix things, but you have to be on point. So if things are a mess, if it's time to triage, what do you do?
Well, I'll add one more thing not to do.
Oh, yes.
And this is related to the triage. Sometimes people think like, okay, I've put all this off, I'm behind, but I'm just going to start making my outlines from scratch, and that's going to help me learn the material, and then I'll be fine on the exam. I also think it's too late for that.
Yeah.
So if you are in this situation where you don't have study materials, you haven't really put this stuff together, step number one is really to find good materials. And these need to focus kind of on the type of exam that you're facing. Mm-hmm. So, if you have a take-home exam, finding a really good student outline, say it's a 12-hour take-home, can be really helpful. I mean, when I say good materials, I basically mean like a solid commercial outline and or a very, very solid student outline from this class.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's key.
I also think 1 or 2 items like that. Yeah. And then you work from those.
And one of the things I think it's important to remember if you are going to pull those commercial outlines is you still are only responsible for what was covered in your class.
Right.
So you need to go through that outline and compare it with your syllabi and and probably a student outline that was made for that class, and make sure that you're only studying stuff that's going to show up on your test.
Right. And the same with that student outline, because there's no guarantee your professor covered precisely the same topics both years. So you got to be smart about this, but I think you also just have to find one of these things and then, use the table of contents to figure out the pieces that you need to know.
Yeah. You also need to think about the type of exam that the professor's giving. Is it multiple choice? Is it short answer? I've even heard true false come out recently. Traditional essay. Is it, you've got to figure out what type of exam you're facing, what those exams have looked like in the past, and then come up with how you're going to get ready for the exam you're going to be presented to. Because I think that we find this a lot, that students just want to study, but you're studying for the exam you're getting.
Right.
And so the more you study in a targeted way, the better the outcome is going to be.
Right. Because, for example, I only had essentially open book exams until I think my very final semester. I had half of one was closed, and yours were all closed books. So we're going to study differently for those. We're still going to need to process the material, understand it, practice using it. But at some point, you're going to have to sit down and actually memorize it. Whereas I'm not going to do that. Maybe I should spend that time making, an attack plan or a cheat sheet that I can use on my test.
Right. Exactly. And, you've got to make sure that you are thinking about the big picture. When you're triaging, you can't get caught up and spend 5 hours on a minor issue.
No.
I think that you can get sucked into saying, but I don't understand how this one little thing
This exception
works.
To the exception. It's like, okay, well, can you do like the primary analysis? Because unless you can do that pretty consistently, this detail is not relevant.
Yeah. So you got to just keep your eye on the ball and remember that, you're not going to probably have time to know 100% of the stuff that's on that test. So you need to know the heavily tested stuff, the stuff that's shown up on exam over exam, and then the big sweeping things. And then the details are gravy. But you just have to know that you don't have time to do a deep dive into these minor issues.
Right. And, assuming that you have an open book exam, the details are what you might be able to look up.
Right.
Like if you write 90% of the test and then there's one thing where you're like, gosh, I just don't remember. Like I remember we talked about this. You can just have your commercial outline and flip to it. It's fine.
Yeah, it's true.
I remember being in a property exam and literally having no idea on something. And I brought in a horn book with me and I looked it up and I got the test and I got the elements and I started writing. I was like, I would have had no idea what those were.
Yeah, for sure. I think another big thing is you don't have time to panic. You just got to start working.
Yeah. I think this comes down to like that guilt thing too. Sometimes people are so worked up about what they didn't do and they're feeling bad about it and they're down on themselves. That is not helpful. So you can just put all that in a little box and like feel bad about it when your exams are over. Give yourself a day if you want to berate yourself about what an idiot you were. But you don't have time to do that right now. So just put that in that box, like set it aside and focus on what you can do.
Yep, for sure. All right, so let's think about like other things that people need to focus on during the reading week. I mean, one is you shouldn't study all night. You've got to sleep.
Right. And I think this can be a huge problem. I mean, I had sort of carved out time to sleep my first semester, and then I wasn't able to fall asleep. So I would be there for 4 hours every night looking at the, window and being like, why am I not sleeping? And then I would sleep for 4 hours. And after you do that for 2 or 3 weeks, it kind of makes you crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Don't recommend it.
Don't recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think about, ways of sleep hygiene. Do you need some sort of sleep aid? These are things to think about now, not when you're halfway into the exams.
Yeah, exactly. And with this, you've got to think about your stress level. If you are just, anxious and spiraling, then you've got to come up with some coping mechanisms because your brain will literally not function. You're likely to maybe get sick. All of this stuff is interconnected. So you got to take care of your stress level and your body. And that's usually fixed by the sleep thing, by eating good food and exercising. Not exciting things, but they are things that seem to be the only thing that makes this stuff better.
Yeah, it's one of those things we all wish it wasn't true, but it's kind of true, So think about what you're eating, think about if you're getting some fresh air, some exercise, think about what reduces stress for you. Things like guided meditations and yoga and that kind of thing can be really great because they're physical things you can do that really reduce stress, because anxiety and stress are such a huge piece of, kind of how people end up performing too. I think some of this also comes down to really like scheduling and planning your study time, your off time, all of these things.
Yep. Yeah, you just have to have a plan. And, I would say if you're not one of those people who wants to develop a whole plan for the whole week, at least plan the, big sweeping balance of the week and then plan a day ahead. So I think one of the things sometimes folks can do is they get up in the morning and then they're like, wow, should I do my stuff today? It's like, you don't have time to do that.
Bad idea.
Bad idea. You have to have a plan before you go to sleep. So you know exactly like when you're going to study, when you're going to work out. Oh, you're going to do this to a 12 o'clock, yoga class. And you got to have a plan or it doesn't happen. I can use myself as an example. COVID makes things, even though we're all still working a lot, like much more unstructured. And I will always play the like, I'll work out later game. It's always like, oh, I'll work out at 10. And I did this today. I was going to work out at 10 and then I got caught up on a project. I was like, I'll work out after this podcast recording. And then I was like, oh, but then I only have like 45 minutes. I'll do it after the next thing. I mean, and then it's like 5 o'clock and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to do it right now or I'm not going to be able to do it all day. Unnecessary. Come up with a plan, put it on your schedule. My day's so much happier when I do that. But today was not one of those days. And this constant thing.
Now that I've started playing tennis and you have to reserve the courts a week ahead, it's great because it's just on my schedule. And I look at my schedule yesterday, I'm like, oh, apparently at 1:30 I'm playing tennis. Okay, I'll plan my day around that,
Yeah, it's true. It really helps. So, planning and scheduling things, much more helpful and just doesn't, create more decision fatigue. Because I think that's one of the things about the COVID times is many of us are struggling with decision fatigue. And
absolutely.
So anything, you can do to reduce the number of decisions you have to make in a day just makes yourself more productive.
Yeah, I agree. And, maybe as simple as getting out an index card before you go to sleep or before you have dinner, and then you write down, your basic plan for the next day. And then when you wake up, you just see the plan, you execute the plan. So much easier.
Yep. Now, what if schools aren't doing a reading week because they are pretty condensed? How do you think people should kind of approach this lead up to finals?
Well, I think here it's even more about figuring out what your time looks like and scheduling that. And obviously, if you don't have this extra time, you've got to start earlier. So, that's just the reality of it. So you've got to start carving out blocks of time that you would do the things you would typically do in the reading week. You've got to carve them out beforehand because otherwise you're going to get to the end of classes and have a day or two before your first exam. And that's going to be probably kind of a mess.
Yep. So if you haven't done so yet, take out a calendar, write your exams on the calendar, then start counting backwards and make a plan.
Right.
It's got to get, the work's got to get done, and how that's going to balance with your class prep and things like that. Like we said, they can test on the last few topics in the semester. So you can't just say, oh, I'll ignore class and prepare for exams. That's a mistake.
Right. Well, the good news is most people are not commuting or anything right now. So you should actually have extra time that if you are focused about it, you can put towards, studying for your exams, hopefully.
True.
Well, good luck, everyone.
Yes. You're going to make it through the pandemic, the first full pandemic semester.
Right. It's going to be interesting, I'm sure. But yeah, you're going to hopefully feel a sense of satisfaction at the end of it that you have done this.
Yep. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. This podcast episode idea was actually from a listener, so you can always send us questions and we will do podcast episodes on it. So send over your questions. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.